for having excellent navigational abilities in finding the building. I am really thrilled to be here on behalf of the Center for Arab and Middle Eastern Studies. My name is Nadia Speiti, and I'm Assistant Professor of Middle East Studies here at AUB. And I'm also stepping in for CASAR, the Center for American Studies and Research Abroad, in place of the director, Amy Zenger, who is not able to be here tonight because she's on a business trip outside of the country. But it is my pleasure to be able to introduce Dr. Sijini Reddy, who is here to give a talk tonight entitled Women on the Loose to Women in the Lead, Indian Nurses Navigate the International Division of Nursing Labor. Dr. Reddy is the Thomas Tam Visiting Professor of Asian American Studies at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York and Associate Professor of American Studies at the State University of New York, Old Westbury. Her work has focused on histories of U.S. imperialism, immigration, and South Asian diaspora, as well as on mass criminalization, immigrant rights, and U.S.-based social movements. She is the author, from which this talk is taken, of Nursing an Empire, Gendered Labor and Migration from India to the United States, published in 2015, and co-editor of The Sun Never Sets, South Asian Migrants in an Age of U.S. Power, published in 2013. And both books have also been published in South Asia by Orient Black Swan. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Reddy. And this is great because we can also have a much more sort of personal discussion. So thank you for coming.
I was going to clap too.
You can clap.
I feel like clapping too. Well, I want to thank you all for coming and for finding the building. And I'm really thrilled to be in Lebanon, to be in Beirut, and to be at the American University here. I'm also deeply grateful to Nadia for arranging this and for bringing me here. It's such a, to have this kind of engagement with my work is just fantastic. And I should look at the camera. I'd also like to thank, she's not here, but Amy, who also helped to set this up, Amy Zenger, and then the CASAR, right, the Center for American Studies. And it's great to have one of my old colleagues from graduate school in American Studies, Adam, here too.
It's a small world.
It's a small world.
Big, but a small world.
And so this project, this book, Nursing an Empire, it kind of grew up alongside my involvement in the field of American studies at a particular moment, so the late 90s, the early part of this century, or this millennium, when American studies was really embracing a critique of U.S. empire. It was kind of becoming more prominent in the field again. As a field, American studies was kind of born out of Cold War geopolitics, right? So it was really pro-American empire in a lot of ways. But at this particular moment, there was a critique of U.S. empire that was in the field. And people were talking a lot about transnational methods, so methods that were crossing the globe in terms of research. And so it was also at the same time, as that was going on, American Studies was developing as a really vibrant location for critical and comparative ethnic studies, so African American studies, Black studies, Asian American studies, and Latino and Indigenous studies, right? So those things were happening at the same time. At the same time that was my scholarly world, personally, the book also grew out of a deep involvement in the growth of South Asian scholarship, activism, and arts in the New York City area. So I was really involved in that. That shaped a lot of my thinking going into this. And so that's how I usually introduce the book. But when I was preparing or kind of revising this talk to give here in Beirut, I thought, even though we thought we were so radical or cool in terms of critiquing U.S. empire, we were doing it in a way that was also part of a U.S. bubble where the argument about empire is already radical because the general sort of consensus in the United States is one of imperial amnesia and also the naturalization of capitalism, right? That's just the way things are. And so I was curious to hear how a kind of argument and a framing of my work that comes out of a very sort of provincial U.S. way of looking at the world that comes in response to that provincialism sounds outside of the United States. So that's one thing that I thought this talk could open up. So I encourage you to ask questions in that way, if anything comes to you. And in terms of, that's my sort of, that's where the book comes from, and that's also how I would present it here. In terms of the method that I used, I combined archival materials from both the United States and India with secondary sources, just books. There's very little material about Indian nurses, very, very little. It was for reasons that I can go into, but so I had to rely a lot on secondary sources also. And then I did a series of life history interviews with Indians who were nurses, who had immigrated to the United States as nurses, right? And so several of them I did multiple interviews with, some I just did one, really in the format of oral history, not ethnography or anthropology. And so I never really privileged any of those forms of research over the other ones, but in many, many ways, the interviews really form the heart of the book. And the words of the nurses are really what sent me to certain archives, rather than the other way around. And their stories and their silences are really what helped me to pose the questions that guided the book. And so actually in the talk that I'm going to do next week, I'm going to go more into that, more into how they shaped the narrative. But here, with that as a thumbnail sketch, I want, you're going to have to excuse me for the crassness of this, but I want to begin my talk by removing a piece of shit. All right, but this is really not coming from me. It's in the words of Doctor of Education and registered nurse Suresh Khanna, and this is her story. Okay, so this is a quote. The old man was brought into the minor operating room for a rectal examination. He was crying with severe pain in the abdomen. He said with folded hands, "Miss, give me something to relieve this unbearable pain. I'm dying with this. I cannot take it anymore. Please help me." After the rectal examination, the doctor diagnosed him as having an impacted rectum. He ordered an enema, which was given instantly with no result. The patient kept on crying as there was added pressure with the enema water and nothing else was coming out except the enema water. At that time, I decided to wear a glove and do a manual removal of the feces from the rectum. The decision was based upon the rationale that the removal of some feces will make room for another enema, which will help the patient. Believe me or not, there were 2 loaded kidney basins of hard pieces like rocks of feces. The rectum was not emptied totally because there was danger of a sudden release of pressure from the abdomen, and the minor OR was full of the foul smell. The doctor came running and saw that scene, which brought such relief to the patient. Until today, it gives me so much satisfaction to think about the incident and the gratifying outcome. End quote. The story is from Dr. Khanna's book, The History of Nursing in India from 1947, the year of independence, to 1989, which she gave to me as a gift during our interview in 2003. And it's a recollection from her early days in nursing school at Irwin Hospital in New Delhi, India. And it was really singular among the accounts I heard over the course of my research, because very few scenes could evoke the stigmatization of nurses and nursing experienced by my interviewees and their cohort more clearly than this predicament with the old man in the operating room. Because nobody else would give me such vivid detail. Most nurses would at least admit that at the time when they entered nursing school, which was the mid-20th century, they struggled against nursing's deep association with the dirty work of dealing with the human body's most intimate functions. And on the Indian subcontinent, these tasks also have a strong association with ritual pollution, and work historically relegated to dominant Hindu society's outcasts, Dalits, right, ex-untouchables, and others relegated to the margins of class society. So there are groups of people in India who, by virtue of caste, are manual scavengers, right, who have to remove human feces. That's very much in the public consciousness related to low caste. So nurses came to be looked upon as the loose and lowly women who dare to perform this work, often outside of their own caste boundaries. So in that view, no good girl could be a nurse, because she would not circulate in public, unregulated, tending to men outside her family, and what is more, dealing with their most untouchable parts. Only families desperate for money would allow their women to do such deeds, adding nursing to the shaming effects of poverty and a lack of male economic authority. Nursing that sort of came to be associated with a certain kind of prostitution of poor women who do dirty work for others, especially other men. So in other words, it became a focal point for anxieties over what happens when women are on the loose, outside the holds of the patriarchal family structures and their caste, class, sexual, and gender norms. So this was definitely the case for Dr. Khanna, who entered nursing school at a time when it was unheard of girls, and this is her quote, especially from Hindu families, especially Punjabis, which is a region of North India, to become nurses. She described to me how, quote, the neighbors were just telling my mother that she will not get married. She's in the mortuary working with dead people. She's giving enemas, all sorts of rotten things they will present to her instead of giving her the good picture, end quote. The neighbors' warnings reinforce, point by point, the anxiety around women on the loose. In this particular case, the scandal of nursing was also a sign of the community's newly destabilized status. Dr. Khanna comes from a family of Hindu Punjabis who were partition refugees. They had relocated to New Delhi, which is the capital of India, is still the capital of India, during the violent subdivision of the Indian subcontinent into India and Pakistan in 1947. So for them, freedom from British rule had materialized through loss of property, possession, family, and friends. Consequently, it was also a moment of real downward mobility and adjustment to a lower class, if not caste, status. Within this context, her entry into nursing could be read as a sign of the degree of her family's dispossession, where loss of property is also read as loss of propriety. But things have changed. So when I met Dr. Khanna in 2003, she had forestalled retirement. She was jetting between India and the United States in her position as the director of a 21st century private nursing college in India, right? And those have become, as part of the background of my research, at the time when I was doing research, which was right after 2001, when immigration had kind of been really clamped down in the US, nursing, because of the shortage, is one of the few ways that people could still get in with a work visa. And in India, there were like cropping up all these nursing colleges, private, that were specifically gearing people for the international market. And a lot of men were going into them because it's one of the few ways that South Asian men could still get into the United States with a work visa. So she was kind of helping with that. So with her career still in motion and on the cutting edge, she described to me how now she receives accolades from the very same family and friends who had scared her mother. So she's like, now those people turn around, including my relatives, they say, oh, she is a goddess, everybody will be calling, get us this appointment, get us that appointment. Still, I do not have a grudge or hard feelings, I just pity them more, they were ignorant, that's all I can say. So she's very kind, right? Over the course of our conversation, it became clear that Dr. Khanna does more than pity her erstwhile detractors and their sanctioned ignorance. She actually challenges them. This comes through clearly in her rewriting of that scene, which is the original scene of her kind of defilement, right, into a scene displaying her medical daring and expertise, right? She kind of takes that back. It also came through in her efforts to, this is a quote, to go forward and with this and not to be stationary with a nursing diploma. And that determination took her from New Delhi to Canada and finally to New York, where in 1979 she earned her doctorate at Teachers College in Columbia University. And her commitment to her career in caring didn't prevent her from getting married. She got married, she raised a family in the suburbs of New York. And over the years, her home also, she was a real community builder, she is a real community builder, has served as a hub for many meetings and gatherings, and she has developed a real role in building a community of Indian nurses and families in the New York metropolitan area. So, in fact, her orientation towards community building is a central part of her project in that book that I took the scene from, The History of Nursing in India. It culminates with an appendix highlighting members of the Nursing Honor Society of India, which is a group that she founded to honor nurses left out of the Indian government's award system. So, Khanna Society, she focuses on the accomplishments of Indians living abroad, primarily in North America, as well as, though to a lesser extent, nurses who work in private hospitals in India. So taken together, the portrait of the people who she highlights present a collective challenge to the anxiety produced around women on the loose in the world of waged work. And Dr. Khanna and her cohort pose this challenge from their position in what I would call, it's just like a diaspora of decolonization. They are nurses who emigrated out of independent India during the Cold War as part of the mass transfer of skilled Indian labor to the United States at that time. Until recently, very little attention has been paid to nurses. Mostly people think about Indian doctors, scientists, engineers, right? Those are like the sort of consummate subjects of the brain drain in terms of Indian labor internationally, right? And they not only went to the United States, but really Indian doctors were kind of all over the world. Mm-hmm. And on the flip side of that, so that's the global perspective, the brain drain, but on the flip side, the doctors and engineers were really part of the model minority in the United States, right? This kind of post-civil rights, post-World War II group of people of color who came to the U.S. but were able to quickly enter the middle class, and because of immigration law, are really able to bring their reform nuclear families in the United States. So nurses, even though they were part of this migration, are never really thought about or figured in the sort of image of Indian professional managerial migrants during this time period. And their migration kind of differs in many significant ways from, let's say, the Indian doctor. Right. First, India's pool of internationally mobile nursing labor was dominated by women, right? Even though many Indian doctors are women too, that's not who you think of necessarily, right? But nurses, because of the gendering of the profession, so they're dominated by women. It drew heavily from Indians' Christian communities for reasons that I'm going to get into, whereas the brain drain was a Hindu phenomenon in a lot of ways, even though it was never wholly Hindu, right? And also, especially from its southern states, especially Kerala, which is the southernmost state in India, and its lower middle classes. So all of these things, point by point, are different from the other groups of professionals who are coming to the U.S. So, and I'll get into that here. But in addition, as indicated by Dr. Khanna's story, at mid-20th century, nursing in India was really an ill-regarded and ill-paid occupation. So for them, migration to places like the United States, equal professionalization. For everybody else, they already were professionals in India, right? So that was another difference. So let's see. And while professional nursing in the U.S. at the time remained stratified and embattled, for Indian nurses at this time, right, it was professionalization. So the other final thing that differentiates them, at least for now, is that they led emigration out of their communities, and they often remain the primary income earners in the families that reformed because their husbands didn't have skills that could translate into the market. So they not only were the first ones to come, they remained the breadwinners in the families that reformed in the United States. So that's the kind of shift from Women on the Loose to Women in the Lead, which is the title in the book. Women in the Lead is a Janus-faced figure. On the one hand, she symbolizes the economic opportunities and institutional access promised by immigration to the United States. So that's surely why Dr. Khanna's relatives were all like, get us this, get us that. At the same time, the female dominance characterizing nurse immigration has also been a source for renewed fears about the potentially unchecked power of women in the lead. That fear, right, came across to me in the very first story that I recorded for this project, which was told to me by Vasantha Daniel, who's a retired nurse educator based in Washington State. The story was not entirely her own. It had been told to her by her friend Joe, which is not his real name. Joe was a former nurse recruiter and fellow member of the Indian immigrant community in the greater Seattle area. His story takes place in the 1970s, which is kind of the golden era for nurse immigration to the United States. This was after the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act had ended race-based exclusion in U.S. immigration law, so Asians were allowed to come in, and also included occupational preference quotas, which is why all these professionals were able to come from the third world. And so one of the significant things about people who migrated at that time is that you arrived with a green card, right, which means you have legal permanent residency in the United States, can sponsor relatives. That does not happen anymore. Right? Like nobody's arriving with a green card, right? Days, yeah. But at this time, right, it was really like this kind of heyday of immigration, right? So people were like able to come with a job and with a green card. And so Daniel explained to me that in the midst of this kind of immigration frenzy, right, the brain drain, the model minority, many nurses had difficulty navigating the set of professional tests and job opportunities that had opened up, and so this business, or supposedly they had difficulty, so this business of nurse recruiting sprung up around them, right, kind of to make money off of their potential. And so recruiters would promise to take care of all the paperwork, and they'd secure a job, get you a green card, and then you'd have to pay them something. Right, so in many cases, what happened was that nurses would continue to have to pay off these recruiter fees after getting to the United States. So it sort of became a racket, right? So Joe's story concerns a young Indian nurse who had come to the U.S. at that time through the help of a recruiter. And her recruiter not only knew of a job, he also knew of a man. Right? He knew of a man in New Delhi who was trying to come to the U.S., so he approached our nameless nurse with a proposal. Would she marry this man so that he could gain entry into the United States? And then the deal would be that the marriage was on paper only, and that once he got his papers, they could get a divorce and kind of go on their way. It's a very typical green card marriage, right? The way that people think of it. So apparently the nurse agreed, right? But things start to go awry after the marriage because she refused to grant him a divorce. As the story goes, she decided that her husband, this is what was told to me, that her husband was just too good looking to let go of. Right? And unfortunately, it appears her husband was not so taken with her, right? So as soon as he got his green card, he left her. But then she didn't let him go. She actually tracked him down repeatedly, only to have him disappear again repeatedly. And eventually, as Daniel explained to me, right, her husband just, quote, didn't know what to do. He got so desperate, so he said, how am I going to get rid of this woman? Then he joined the armed forces and he went away. But this is what she told me, right?
The American army?
Yes, just wait.
Okay.
But she wouldn't keep quiet. She said, well, I'm not going to let him get off that easy. So she somehow tracked him down through the recruiting office somewhere and reported to the armed services that here was her husband who had deserted her, hadn't written her or contacted her for so many months or years or whatever. I don't know how the story ends. I told Joe to let me know, but I don't know, end quote. So that's the story, though, right? That her husband went to the army and she chased after him. So that's where Danielle's telling kind of ends off, right? Trailing off inconclusively, concealing as much as it reveals, and kind of filtered through so many different narratives, we have no idea, right? What sort of obligation was the nurse under to her recruiter? To whom does she really appeal? How would the U.S. Armed Forces respond to the charge that one of its immigrant members had deserted his immigrant wife? How did he enroll in the U.S. Armed Forces, right? And ultimately, does she get her man? We just don't know, right? We have no idea, what happened to that story. Or does he disappear according to his own plan, right? And the facts are not really what's at stake here. And instead, the way that I understand that story is that it's really meant to be told as a tall tale, right? And for the telling and retelling. And like every good fable, it has its moral, which is when told to nurse recruiters and or male immigrants, it fairly screams, buyer beware. That nurse with a ticket to ride shall have your hide, right? It's like visions of this castrating female are really front and center here, right? Yeah. Mitigated only by my own nurse, her refusal to give us the ending, right? She kind of refuses to say that the nurse was really this, that, or the other. And her uncertainty opens up the possibility for multiple outcomes, including possibly happy ones. But, as it stands, the story is really about the anxiety that gendered and sexualized relationships in this immigration pattern produced. And it's not simply an anxiety based on nurses' access to the labor market. It's very much tied to their ability to access the family reunification provisions that are actually the heart of the 1965 immigration law. That's still the heart of the U.S. immigration system, is a certain vision of family. So throughout my interview process, I heard example after example of female nurses who came to sponsor their spouses and, by extension, their entire families and communities. And it was precisely the institutional economic empowerment of our anonymous nurse recruit that once again raises the specter of women on the loose and returns her to us through an anxiety over women in the lead. So how am I going to get rid of this woman? That's the question, right? So the persistent degradation of the labor of nursing and of Indian nurses is one clear cause for their near absence from the historical archives and statistical records. On the flip side, when and where nurses have come into view, it has been in no small part through an analysis of the stigmatization. So the one major book, I'll do this quickly, that's about, prior to mine, the one major book that was about this immigration pattern to the United States really focused on the fact that nurses were stigmatized within this way. And the author, Sheba Miriam George, she kind of says that, she does this, her ethnography, which is more than interviews, right? She's really part of these communities. And she does this thing where there are these transnational media circuits now, the internet, right? And all the video stuff, which actually the stigma of nurses is an Indian thing, right? And it persists. She found it persisted within Indian immigrant communities, and it persists because we're able to still get information from India and reproduce it in the United States. Right, so she's saying it's still, even though it's transnational, it's really Indians that are the ones who can't really deal with nursing labor or can't really deal with women. And in fact, the United States is a better place for nurses because nurses are professionalized in the U.S., can actually get higher jobs, and they're not, nurses themselves, that's her analysis, are not stigmatized in the U.S. It's Indians who are stigmatizing nurses transnationally. Right, that's sort of the basis of her thing. So it's really India, right? Even though she would, I think, balk at me describing it this way, and it's on, that it's Indians in a way, or Indian culture that somehow, and especially if you think about caste and how caste is always talked of as an Indian thing and an Indian problem and kind of a backwardness that Indians have, right? This is another example of that. Even though most nurses, and especially the nurses in her study, are all Indian Christians, right? So this seemingly strict separation between India and the United States is actually something that her work shares with most people, including, most people who have analyzed Indian immigration to the United States at this time, because all of their analysis rests on the fact that it was the change in U.S. immigration law that let everybody in. And so they sort of don't really look at the relationship between India and the United States before that change in the law happens, right? They're just the lever for immigration is if the U.S. opens the gate, people come. If they shut it, people don't come. And that's completely taken out of the context of global dynamics and sort of has the U.S. in isolation, right? And so most analysis of skilled labor migration to the United States in the mid-20th century during the Cold War really follows that pattern of the causal factor is the shift in U.S. immigration law. And so one of the things that I do in my book is, like, that's the main thing that I kind of take apart in a lot of different ways. And so part of how I do that is that by looking at this stigmatization of nurses as something that was produced through a colonial context of Anglo-American capitalist imperialism since the British colonization of the subcontinent, through to the period when nurses are. So I expand that framework in a way that looks at shifts within capitalist imperialism between the United States and Great Britain, right? Because India is seen as like the consummate place of British colonization. But so what I do is the book begins on the Indian subcontinent, right, during the period of British colonization, and also when and that's when hospital nursing, as we now know it, was brought to India, right? It was part of the package of colonization. Initially, it was really just in relation to British people who were there, but eventually it spread as a tool for colonization. But I also really focus on how, particularly in relation to biomedicine, the colonization of India was never simply a British affair, right? It was really the medical part was really led by people from the United States. And so, like AUB, right, Protestant medical missionaries were the first and the primary people and institutions to educate and employ Indians as nurses, right? And U.S. missions were the first to really do that. And so the Reverend Dr. John Scudder Sr. was both the first medical missionary ever deputed by the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions and the first medical missionary to work in India. Because India was big in the U.S. colonial imagination at that time, because they were still getting literature from Britain, right, about India and the natives or whatever. And so he arrived in 1836 as part of a movement that made U.S. missionaries second only to the British on the subcontinent. But in terms of medical missionaries, they were really the first, and their primacy continued through the feminization of medical work, which happened in the late 19th century. In 1869, Dr. Clara Swain became the first female medical missionary ever to leave the United States and the first to work in India. So again, the first to leave the U.S. were going to India. And at the time of her arrival, the male-dominated medical establishment in the U.S. had only reluctantly begun to open itself up to women as doctors. So these earliest female graduates in the United States, they faced barriers upon graduation where they couldn't really get jobs outside of gynecology, and even there they couldn't really develop their own practices. And so the colonial field offered them the possibility for professional mobility, autonomy, and authority in a way that they couldn't get in the United States. And a lot of them were able to found their own practices and lead institutions that turned into colleges and hospitals. So the Vellore Christian Medical College, which was founded by Dr. Ida Sophia Scudder, and she's the granddaughter of the first medical missionary to come to the U.S., it remains one of the top 2 biomedical institutions in India to this day, right? It's really like top tier. Do you know about Vellore? No? Okay. So it was one of the many female medical missions that were central to the incubation of nursing in India. And at the turn of the 20th century, when female medical missions expanded, it used to be like one woman would show up alone and like kind of have her practice, and that might grow into something. But as they grew into institutions, it had to be more and more people. But rather than hiring Indians, they would bring missionary nurses and more white women actually to fill the leadership there. And so it became a space of professionalization for both nurses, female nurses and doctors from the United States, but also from the United Kingdom and Europe, who at the time, especially nurses in the United States and the UK in the late 19th century and early 20th, they were considered loose and lowly women. They had no professional status or respectability, and so their ability to migrate to India and have authority over Indian nursing labor and Indian patients actually propped up their own process of professionalization, and it was really based on the hierarchies of colonial rule, right? So, and in terms of the Indians who were hired at these institutions, these mission institutions, right, the missionaries would consistently characterize Indians as, incompetent, low, kind of all the colonial characterizations, and the poor working conditions at mission conditions also made Indians not respect the women and men at first. It really was a colonial thing to make it only women nurses. At first, both women and men wanted to go there. So it was this context of the missions that actually created this, or not created, but when you think about caste in India, it was really recreated under colonialism. Caste existed beforehand, but it was given new meanings right, under colonization. And so nursing, as a modern occupation, played into caste, but also through the colonial context that's where the stigma comes from, right? Oh, okay. So also, the missionary, in terms of missionary migration, female doctors and nurses who came to India had to remain single, right? If they didn't remain single, then the paid work, right? Like the Christian civilizing mission relied on a certain ideal of a white heteropatriarchal nuclear family, with a male breadwinner and a female bread baker. And so white women workers, even when they went to India, because that was where that model had to represent civilization. So when they went there, they had to actually either remain single and work with pay, or if they got married, they had to work without pay, right? They lost their ability to earn a wage, because that would threaten that ideal. So you have this kind of interesting history of women-run institutions that are all women, that are actually all women's spaces, but they were, they themselves, their own sexuality was really policed, right? It was really policed in the colonial context. And it was really policed through notions of Victorian femininity. And the way that they were able to kind of work around that was this, there was this global call for women's work for women, right? Because there was this vision that Indian women, elite Indian women, couldn't get the proper medical care because they were locked away in harems and zananas, and no men could enter there, and only other women could enter there. And this was the rationale for white women to be able to come to India and build themselves up. They're well, the women of the United States have to rescue the women of India, and only we can do it, right? Male doctors can't do it. And so they created this question, this women question, that actually gave space for some women to rise up and other women to remain. And the idea was that not only would they go in and give them medical care, but they would convert them to Christianity, right? Those are the two. Ultimately these are all missionaries, right? So they're trying to convert someone. Okay, there's a lot more to be said about all of that, and you can ask me that later, but I'm going to move on here. Okay, now I'm going to get to the Rockefeller Foundation. So first, it's medical missionaries, right? But and I'm just going to talk about this very briefly. I'll talk about it more when Jordan and I do our talk together. But the remaking of colonial medicine, what we now know as biomedicine, in both the United States and around the world, was really stewarded by the Rockefeller Foundation between World War I and World War II. Missionary stuff peaked around World War I, right? And right at that time is when the Rockefeller Foundation came in. And I go into this in much more detail in my book, but right now I just want to make note of two things. The first is that by examining the work of U.S. Protestant missionaries and the Rockefeller Foundation, we expand the terrain of where and how we ask questions of U.S. imperialism. So in this, I really am following the work of a scholar, Catherine Sinisa Choi, who makes connections between U.S. colonialism in the Philippines and Filipino nurse immigration to the United States, right? And there the connection is pretty clear because the Philippines were a direct colony of the United States, right? But in turning to India, I'm okay, India was never a direct colony of the United States, but the presence, the 100-year-long presence and the really pivotal presence of Protestant medical missionaries and then the Rockefeller Foundation in establishing not only biomedical nursing in India, but also the global medical map, was really what fed into the ability for nurses and doctors and engineers to migrate to the United States when the laws changed, right? So for me, that raises a kind of different question. So we have the U.S. as a junior partner in British imperialism on the subcontinent, but we also have questions about the colonial civilizing mission as an arena. Okay, sorry, I'm getting a little confused myself here. But in what way? So both medical missionaries and the Rockefeller Foundation, when they come in, are kind of promoting a civilizing mission, right? Both medicine and Christianity, right, are going to civilize the natives. And it's this kind of subcontracting out of the duties of the civilizing mission that allows space for U.S. institutions in British-dominated India. But it also is kind of a preface for Cold War power dynamics, right, where there's not direct territorial colonization of places, but there's still control in a lot of different ways of governments and of the economies of places. And this, I feel is kind of presaged by the work of U.S. institutions in British India, where they actually worked with, I trace this really in detail, they worked with the nationalist elite, right, to kind of promote medicine as how India would modernize after decolonization. And so the production of doctors after independence was really linked to the presence of things like the Rockefeller Foundation in India and how they promoted a certain vision of medicine that wasn't fit for the needs of a nation that was coming out of colonialism, but produced people who then could migrate out because they had the credentials that were needed in the global labor force, right? And the second, so that's one thing that I talk about in relation to Rockefeller. The second thing is really, that I'm going to touch on here, is how that relates to the institutionalization of Jim Crow segregation in the United States. Because in addition to the global stage in public health, the Rockefeller Foundation actually incubated its public health agenda in the U.S. South during Reconstruction and during Jim Crow, after that period. And their first major venture in this arena was the eradication of hookworm in the U.S. South, which is
Hookworm, is that what you said?
hookworm.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, and they worked off the theory. The foundation officers worked off the theory that hookworm was the germ of laziness, and that it had been brought to the South by enslaved Africans, which is why they suffered from it less than the poor Southern whites who they infected, and who had built up African Americans had built up generations of immunity. When the Rockefeller Foundation's vision shifted, so they had this whole thing where, that was, I could go into that more, but when it shifted to the global stage, right, and the British Empire, they actually said that the source for hookworm was not formerly enslaved Africans, but indentured Indians. And they have this film that kind of shows India as like the source of global hookworm, coolies, right? And so what that allowed them to do by saying that Indians were the source was to get into the British Empire. The first place where they did public health was in British Guyana and in Madras in South India, right? So that's how they use like sort of the vision of these disease bodies to enter into British Empire, as well as, and to be honest, because it was the Rockefeller Foundation after the Civil War, for Northern capitalists to get into the U.S. South, right, after the war, to kind of consolidate that process. So, and also the last piece about the kind of Indian coolies as the cause fed into, this was the same time where there were a lot of anti-Asian movements in the United States, which is how all the laws that barred Asians from entering legally were passed. So it was kind of, they were going out globally in terms of public health while they were like knocking Indians out of the ability to legally immigrate to the United States, which happened in 1917, and then Indians were barred from naturalization in 1923. Okay, so at the same time that this was going on, there's this book that's written called Mother India by this U.S. journalist, Catherine Mayo, that sent shockwaves around India, the U.S., and the U.K. Do you know about this book? No? Okay. It was published in 1927, and it has these really lurid details of deviant Indian sexuality, especially degraded and degrading Hindu Indian women, positioning Indian women, Hindu women, as both the root cause as the root cause for Indians' inability to rule themselves. It was really a manifesto to continue. She's American, but it was really a manifesto to continue the British colonization of the subcontinent. And the same thing about deviant Asian sexuality was really key to the achievement of Asian exclusion in the United States, right? So it's kind of like diseased and hyper over deviant sexualized bodies. Really, the stockpile of images were formed at this time. And so with that, I want to return to the golden years of the 1970s, right, with all the model minority and everything. And because the model minority stereotype also relies on a certain configuration of gender and sexuality, right, not just on race and class. Most of the time people talk about it in relation to race and class. But really it's also about having a proper nuclear family, right, that's heterosexual and that has like a male breadwinner. And that image really came up at the same time as another image of the culture of poverty, so that Puerto Rican and African American sort of domestic U.S. people of color didn't have that family, right, and didn't have like that belief in education or whatever, and so they weren't able to advance in the same way that Asian and Indians were able to. So you have an image of a group of people who are broken because of female-dominated family forms, right? The welfare queen or all this stuff was at the same time that Indian nurses are coming in and being stigmatized for being in the lead, right? And so from that, I want to kind of go to the 1986 Immigration Marriage Fraud Amendments. Okay, in the 1980s, there was a big, kind of like there is now. This is constitutive of U.S. history, right? There was a big kind of under Ronald Reagan kind of demonization of illegal immigration, and that was the last time that large-scale amnesty was passed, actually, for for undocumented immigrants in the U.S. But as part of that, and as part that people talk about less, there was a particular focus on women, third world women, and that was actually through the Immigration Marriage Fraud Amendments. So at stake there was the alleged abuse of spousal reunification, the priority of that in U.S. immigration law, which the priority of family reunification really came about because between 1924 and 1965, European immigration to the United States was restricted because it had been targeting Southern and Eastern Europeans. And the reason why lawmakers prioritized family reunification in the U.S. was they thought that the people who had been cut out because of the quotas that were put onto Europe would be able to bring their family members to the United States. They didn't imagine that people from the third world would use family reunification because people from the third world had been cut out of legal immigration to the United States, and African Americans had been cut off from the African continent. So the imagination was that this would be family reunification would be a way to kind of bring the white people who had been excluded from the United States back in, right? But, you know, after, like, once it starts getting put in place and all these kind of, like, you know, Asian and Latino immigrants are coming in legally, they're saying that family reunification has turned from a mechanism to, you know, to rectify Europe's unfairly excluded members of the United States to a cottage industry, channeling otherwise illegal, undesirable, and excluded persons into the U.S. So the cure to this underground economy was not to eliminate spousal preferences, but instead to distinguish between good and bad marriages. Right? The former were recognized as pillars of U.S. values and virtues. The latter were identified as threats to the United States. So in order to underscore this, congressmen listened to the testimony of 4 citizens who had been duped by smooth-talking aliens. Alien is the legal name for a non-citizen in the United States. So one of the people who's on record for the Immigration Marriage Fraud Amendments is Miss Amita Narielwala. She's a U.S. citizen of Indian origin. In his introduction to her testimony, Senator Alan K. Simpson, a Republican from Wyoming, notes, quote, that in keeping with a common practice in India, her family arranged for her to marry a young Indian doctor still living in India, right? And then the testimony turns over to her, and she describes how she returned to her native Bombay in 1982 for a marriage. And 2 days later, the Indian consulate granted her now husband a U.S. visa, right? This is like the golden age. She continues, this is her quote now. Well, once we entered into the United States, he is a psychiatrist. His attitude, you know, turned completely to be professional, and he disregarded our personal life completely. Went off to obtain a job in the United States. Then he left me in October. So we'd been married 3 months. He left in October, and in January was the first time he called me and let me know at that time that he had married me for a green card, and he had nothing. He did not want to have anything to do with me. After that, he has changed his address, and so I could not locate him, and we had to hire a sheriff who located him for us, and I delivered an annulment paper, which was based on marriage fraud. The courts disregarded that, and I sent him divorce papers, which he disregarded, and I have been to the INS, Senator Hines, she was talking to Senator Hines, Senator, I have spoken to your committee, I have spoken to Congressman Goodling, I have been to the INS at least 50 times, putting in requests, asking them to look into this matter over and over, and have had no results, end quote. Right? Nothing in her testimony indicates how she herself got U.S. citizenship. However, we can make several solid assumptions based on the available material. First, the fact that she's of Indian origin and that her parents remain in India means that she was probably a naturalized citizen, wasn't born in the United States, right? And that she's probably, at that time, she's probably a labor immigrant herself, likely a medical. She's either a doctor or a nurse. My guess is that she's a doctor, because Narielwala is a Parsi name, right, which is the old Iranian community that lives in India. So the arrangement of her marriage to an Indian doctor involves her in the circuits of international and Indian medical migration, and suggests that she might be part of that too. And given her profile, it's very clear that she fits the women in the lead stereotype, right? And the details of her post-marriage dilemma really resonate eerily with that story that I was told at the very beginning of my interview process, right? With the nurse recruiter, it's very similar. The primary difference is that in Joe's story, the nurse knew what she was getting into, and in this story, apparently the woman didn't know, right? At the end of her testimony, Senator Simpson asked Ms. Narielwala if there's anything else about her marriage that she would like to add. And the following exchange ensues. Ms. Narielwala, sir, I did find a letter they had written to his parents. And in the letter, it basically stated, he had written it to his parents and was getting ready to mail it when I found it. And it stated that I have married you to obtain a green card. where I've married her to enter into this country primarily as a doctor, and I'm hoping to call all my family here and build our empire. And end quote. And so he will get his citizenship and bring his family here, Senator Simpson. And Senator Simpson says he said those were the exact words he used in the letter, to build an empire. And then Miss Nouriel Wallace says, yes, sir. Senator Simpson says, I think that sometimes American citizens also forget that a person using the legal immigration system of the United States and petitioning for relatives who are not in the United States can bring in relatives as, I don't want to use the word remote, but I will, because the American citizen, I think, thinks of a cohesive family or a nuclear family as spouse and children, minor children, but to an Asian, it is the spouse, minor children, parents, brothers, sisters, and we have a preference called the fifth preference, which is brothers and sisters of adult U.S. citizens. And I do think we have a record holder in that area, one person who has petitioned for 64 derivative relatives. That may be called building the empire, I think, and indeed it is real. End quote, right? As Senator Simpson's speech progresses, right, it becomes clear that when he's referring to American citizen, he's no longer including Ms. Nouriel, in spite of the fact that she is naturalized. Instead, he distinguishes between American and Asian concepts of a family and how the one is what the law is meant to uphold and the other is how the law has been abused. When he stresses the word empire, he invokes the long association within U.S. political culture of Asian immigration and the fear of a yellow peril, right, the invasion from China and the invasion from... And this now is a shade brown because of Ms. Nouriel. And of course now it's really a shade brown. Yellow peril discourse also originated in the anti-Asian movements of the late 19th century. It didn't originate there, but it really had a big place there. So it effectively combined fears of military invasion, economic competition, and moral degeneracy to figure Asian immigrants as a conquering horde. So as I mentioned already, deviant Asian sexuality was central to this threat. So what Senator Simpson's speech implies, is by its set of associations and implications, is that by the 1980s, the danger of Asian family formation and its distinction from the cohesive nuclear family is what lies at the core of American values. And so the empire is now channeled through Asian women who have been duped by their husbands and become the channels through which their families come to the United States. So, of course, the exchange between Ms. Nouriel and Senator Simpson, the question of victimhood shifts from the abandoned and supplicating Asian women immigrant to the offending and officiating U.S. nation state in a manner that resonates strongly with the history of racialized exclusion from the United States. In this sense, it is indicative of the tenor of the hearings, for the testimony on record highlights repeatedly that individuals from Asia and or Middle Eastern countries are the perpetrators of marriage fraud. The charge of bad marriages as un-American thus comes to be explicitly racialized over the course of the debates, with women in the lead being a particular vector for deviant social reproduction in the United States. Within this political context, it is impossible to read the stigmatization of Indian nurses as women in the lead as a strictly Indian phenomenon, right? Instead, it is connected both to the making and remaking of anti-Asian discourse, understood itself as constitutive of normative U.S. culture, and even more specifically, as connected to the normalization of the white heteropatriarchal nuclear family as the central reproductive unit of the United States. The United States is meant to reproduce whiteness, right? What is more, the outcasting of women of color, our families, and our communities occurred at a time of renewed anxiety about the sanctity of that normative center. So the Asian American model minority was not only a disciplinary tool used against impoverished communities of color like Puerto Rican and African American communities, it was also a disciplinary tool that was used against the mass entry of white middle class women into the workforce, right? Where you should be as a home, right? Or your primary responsibility is that. So in spite of the fact that the Asian American model minority image also completely obscured the high workforce participation of Asian American women across the board, even the ones who were in those nuclear families. So the problem of Indian nurses thus offers a window onto these multiple intersecting and overlapping issues, right? That's kind of mixed up at the end there, but that's what I'm trying to get at, because this is also a time when, this is the last thing I'll say, it's also a time when immigration is shifting more and more towards women being the first ones to come. More and more of the U.S. service sector, as the U.S. economy shifts to a service sector, it's domestic workers and other people, and nurses being at the top of that, actually, they're coming in. So this kind of is before there's a big feminization of labor migration to the United States.
Thank you. Wow.
Sorry, that went down longer than I should have.
Okay, we're a nice, cozy crowd, so this can turn into a much more sort of organic discussion if you want. Questions, comments,
Responses.
feedback, engagement.
It's kind of a lot to take on. Yeah.
Can I ask about Rockefeller in the U.S.?
Yeah.
Because
I want to know more too.
Touched on that.
Yeah, we didn't go into it.
In part because I was Googling the foundation as you were talking, and well, I'm interested in the funding sources for these various foundations, and also the ABCFM is being primarily funded by the colonization of the Southwest and indigenous dispossession and copper mining, etc. So the fact that these are two extractive industries that are kind of laundering their money. The
American Board of Commissioned Foreign Missioners.
Yeah. So I'm just fascinated by that for any number of reasons related to my own work. But Rockefeller as a foundation is established in 1913. So what are they doing in Reconstruction?
So even though the foundation itself wasn't started until 1913, that was actually right after the U.S. Supreme Court ruling that actually broke up Standard Oil into different companies. And like, as soon as, Rockefeller retained major holdings in all of the companies that resulted, and he actually emerged from the breakup of the monopoly richer than he was before. But then they immediately formed the foundation, which was related to their desire to actually both create a tax shelter for their intergenerational transfer of wealth, which is primarily what their foundation was, but also to go global. And prior to that, they had done lots of charities. That Rockefeller was a Baptist and actually was really religious. And his initial charitable advisor was a reverend who actually knew, because Protestant medical missionary work was so prominent, it was actually quite prominent in the United States, he sort of picked up on that. And one of the major things that Rockefeller's advisors did was secularize Christian charity into corporate philanthropy. They really wanted to distinguish the different, and the difference is key. The difference between charity, which is like a giveaway, and philanthropy is that philanthropy is a seed. It's meant to grow. And that when you give philanthropic funds, you're actually creating a situation that you hope perpetuates itself beyond those funds, right? Which, I guess Christians hope to perpetuate Christianity, right, beyond the medical care. So in that way, so what happened was they initially piggybacked onto the fact, his advisor was like, these missionaries have created this structure around the world, but also within the U.S. It was like the first college-based nursing program in the U.S., which is what was now Spelman College, named after Laura Spelman Rockefeller, was two missionaries who went from Worcester, Massachusetts, down to the South after the Civil War to kind of give education, same as the women going to India, but to do it in the U.S. South. And so they got their ideas for how to spread their ideas from the missionaries, and they bought out missionary institutions because they were losing money, because after World War I, that kind of, the zenith kind of went down. And so Rockefeller came in, bought out those at the same time that they restructured medical education in the United States to professionalize it more, to make it less more research. You know how now to be a really high-end hospital, it has to be part of a research institution like a university? That was Rockefeller, right? And they kind of restructured medical education at that time. So they did those things simultaneously and sent these people around the world to train, and then they started to train people around the world in that system of medicine. I don't know if there's more you want to know. Oh, but the Jim Crow. So in the early, they were doing charitable or philanthropic work. It just wasn't under the foundation. It was under the Rockefeller. And actually, when they created the foundation in 1913, they divided the world into different segments. And one was like Latin America, right? Like the East Asia and the U.S. South. And that was a holdover from the Rockefeller work on hookworm in the South. So the U.S. South was one of the regions actually that they initially of the world. Still,
and
so that
and what they divided the world into regions based on what exactly?
Empire. Completely.
Okay,
It was U.S. Empire, British Empire, and internal empire, right? And so one of the things that I argue in my book with going through the details is that the sort of capitalist colonization of the U.S. South provided a model that they exported to the rest of the world.
Which makes perfect sense.
Yeah, and it's definitely true in terms of their public health work in particular. They perfected a model of public health work that then in the U.S. South that then they exported throughout the rest of the world as a way to enter into complicated political training through the goodness of health. Right. So who's going to argue who doesn't want to be healthy, or who doesn't want? Although the British colonial government in India did not care about the health of Indians. Yeah. So they had to kind of they didn't at all. Yeah. So it didn't really work. They tried to work with the British government first, And it didn't work because the British government was like, we don't give a shit, right? But then, who did care a little bit, or who they were able to tap into, are the nationalist elite.
The Indian national.
The Indian nationalist elite. So every gain that the Indian nationalist elite made within the colonial power structure, the Rockefeller Foundation accompanied them and used that opening to insert itself also. So that by the time independence came, Nehru was like, we need to have all these medical schools, we need to do all this stuff, but it was already tapped into the global professional medical circuit as their vision of what it meant to decolonize themselves. Yeah. I don't know if you want to know more about Rockefeller, but
we'll circle that back to it, I'm sure. Yeah.
I was obsessed with the Rockefeller Foundation because they also provide the model for everything. I mean, it's like the model for Bill Gates.
Yeah. The foundations, yeah.
Rockefeller?
Yeah. I mean, what's the status now?
But they're weird because it comes out of Standard Oil, but they just divested from fossil fuel like a year ago. I mean, they're still a major, but it has to do with stages of capitalism because this was at the kind of factory. It was a different moment in capitalism, whereas now we have more like Soros and these are like Bill Gates. We have different kind of capitalists who are providing whereas Ford and Rockefeller now are kind of old-fashioned, right? The way that they do. I mean, it's at the time of Rockefeller, it wasn't even Ford; it was Carnegie and Rockefeller, right? That was the two. Carnegie was doing more like universities, art programs, things like that. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I was wondering about the different kinds of sources you use, so the oral histories and the archives. And so first of all, if you could talk a bit about the life histories.
Mm-hmm.
And then also about sort of your relationship to the different kinds of sources,
Right.
what I mean more like how you worked with the different kinds of sources.
Well, I can give away a little bit of what I'm going to say next week. So this whole thing came out of like a completely non-professional moment, completely non-professional moment in my life where I was at a party on the 4th of July in 2001, like flirting with some guy on a balcony. The fireworks or like whatever, and we're both Indian American, and we're in our early 30s. Well, I started this project a long time ago, and I was saying something about this is like laughable now, right? But I was saying something about how I thought that I was too old now to have children, and he was like, "Oh, my mom, who was like someone of our parents' generation, had me when she was 40." And for an Indian woman of that generation, to have a child at age 40 is actually quite different. And I was like, oh, well, how did that happen? Not literally, but, how did that happen? And he was like, do you want the long version or the short version? And I was completely like this. And I was like, whatever you want, tell me. And he gave me his version. I don't know if it was long or short. But he was like, his mother was a nurse in India. She came to the United States through a grant from the Rockefeller Foundation, and this is like, flirting on a balcony. And then she.
That's how all great ideas start.
she met, his father was actually Malaysian of Indian origin, and had come to the U.S. on a ship. He thought he was landing in Washington, D.C. He was landed in Washington State. And then he was the janitor at the school where she was teaching. And it's this whole romantic thing about a cross-class marriage that they had, and so I'm charmed. And then what I took from that was a bad relationship, ultimately, but that didn't work out so well. But we did try. But the other thing that happened was that I realized that there was this immigration pattern from my parents' generation that was led by women, and that because my initial project was about Dalits and African Americans and caste, but everyone I went to India to talk to was a man who was talking at me from my parents' generation. I was like, this is going to be unbearable. But then I was like, I could talk to our mothers in English, right? In the United States. And so part of it was really generated by a desire for a different kind of story of our own parents' past. Ultimately at the core of it was really I want to know something different. And what I found out about marriage actually was just unbelievable, right? In terms of that being, because his mother was the one who told me that is the first nurse I interviewed, right? And she's the one who told me that story about the nurse recruiter. and was like someone who gave me, and I mean, it was her life history that sent me to the Rockefeller Archives.
It was what?
Her life history that sent me to the Rockefeller Archives, and she went to Vellore, which was the school that was founded by the U.S. medical missionaries, so it completely came from them. I don't think I would have found Rockefeller otherwise, right? So it's complete serendipity, and then talking to her, I found out that the real reason why she came to the U.S. later was that they were trying to arrange a marriage for her.
So she was,
yeah, and you know, she was kind of doing, you know, I mean, anyways, we might need to take that part out, but but in any case, so like it was really nurses' stories. It was our desire for a different story of our own past, and then nurses' stories that led me into this field, and then I went to archives, right? And also all the nurses, it was not just about their marriages. It was like when I sat down with them, because they're all my parents' age. Why aren't you married? Like, where are you? What are you doing? What's your life about? It was really like this kind of mother-daughter exchange that the interviews were. And so I got a different kind of information maybe than someone else who was doing it would have gotten. And a lot of other sons and daughters of nurses were like, oh, you can interview my aunt or you can interview my mom. So it really happened in an intergenerational way that doesn't really play out in the book. I don't know if you want to know more than that, but yeah. So it's not the way you're supposed to do it, but it ended up being really fruitful.
So it was, can I just piggyback on that
Yeah.
real quick? So it was the life histories, kind of like we were saying, that was the core of it, and then the archives went and sort of supported, supplemented,
Or
you
took
know,
it in new
or-
directions.
yeah.
Like I wouldn't have found nothing
Okay.
about the Jim Crow stuff, you know, like
Yeah.
that was
Yeah.
all completely like once I went in, and because I already was trying to think about those connections,
Okay.
I went there and decided to stay there. But yeah.
So something you said at the beginning on that note, that there was very little archival material about the specifically Indian
Yeah.
nurses. Whatever you found was where? In Rockefeller?
Missionaries.
Okay.
Right, and then missionaries
God bless
will
them.
only give you like, I mean, they have an incredible archives, right? But
Yeah.
they only give you like the missionary version of what they think
Sure.
of those things,
So what
right?
you found was
So because I'm originally a literary person, like I would read. There was a play that like Vellore produced about how the institution was founded, and I just read it against the grain of it and found, you know. And then Indian government, no statistics on nurses, none. When the brain drain was happening, they didn't consider nurses part of it because they didn't consider, you know what I mean? And so there's nothing about how many nurses emigrated or anything. And in the U.S., they don't really keep statistics that break down by nationality in that way. Around like so you have nurse immigration, you have Indians, like there's kind of like so there's lots of gaps. They're kind of lost. So life stories are actually really important. Yeah.
Could you say more about the language of institutionalization that the woman used who were traveling from India?
Oh, totally. Because they came. Well, first of all, because their own position when they began as nurses, all of them, right? This generation was so looked down upon, right? Professionalization, like coming to the U.S. I mean, and also there was a lot of self-selection. I used the kind of what they call the snowball method. So I had a couple of nurses, and then I'd be like, "Do you know anyone else who I could interview?" Right? And that's sort of how I got the others. They only told me about people who were already like had a PhD. We're like a nurse educator. We're like, you know, we're the head of their department, right? So I only got this real top tier of nurses, right? And there's a whole other set of women who didn't pass the tests, who worked as undocumented nurses, who like fell out. I mean, I didn't get access to any of them, and I could have pushed for it, but instead I just kind of say that, right? I sort of read their stories in that way. But there was a real effort to produce their work, and that's why I start with that story, as valuable, right? And themselves as accomplished, especially because their pattern was overshadowed by these doctors and engineers who get a lot of respect from everybody, right? And so the language of professionalization was filtered through all those things. And in fact, a couple of the nurses, a lot of them were multiple migrants. They went through the Gulf and then came to the U.S.
That's my
Yeah, or went through Europe at that time, right, and came to the U.S. And so several of them had been through England before coming to the U.S. Now, the post-World War II, post-colonial migration to England was of a different class character than to the United States. It was much more varied, a lot more working class. And so they would distinguish themselves from that, be like, we didn't really like England, right? Everyone could go to England, right? But we came to the U.S. So there was a lot of pride. But I read the pride as in the context of the fact that they had been so, and a lot of them had wanted to be doctors but couldn't. Nursing school was free, right? They had stipends and stuff. They came from families that couldn't afford, right, to send them to medical school. So this was like so there was a lot of struggling with issues of pride, and that's how professionalization really came through. Yeah.
As a profession, nursing, has it changed now?
as a vehicle out, because you can use nursing as a way to fill nursing shortages in other places.
Do you have still perceived as a lesser?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely, yeah. And they're still not paid well or anything like that. But it's seen as a way, like that's why all these private nursing colleges, it's seen as a way to get visa, like go to the Persian Gulf, go to England, go to Australia, go to the United States, yeah.
It's interesting. It's this irony, right? That it's still seen as a lesser profession, but it's a ticket out to a better life.
Yeah, and so men are going into it. Men from men from oppressed classes and castes like will go into nursing now because it's a way out. Mm-hmm. In fact, Dr. Khanna was like, she's like, the first class in her private nursing college was all Muslim men, and she's like, I don't know how to tell them that they should not immigrate to the United States. Seriously, she's like, I don't know what to do. Like, they want to come, but I'm just like, this is not a good time. You know? Yeah. Muslim and also Adivasi, which is indigenous in India. Yeah. Who are very oppressed, yeah.
But what about like how organizing in these communities, like intersects with the work? I think about like in this era about like the whole Caring Cross Generations campaign.
Oh, yeah.
Workers United and that, but also like organizing in India as well, and like just organizing.
Right. I wasn't able to get, because I was doing, most of my stuff in India was related to the past time periods, and there's so little information, but there definitely were nurses who went on strike, and nurses who kind of protested the conditions that they were, that was definitely there. But the nurses who I interviewed were not part of that. They were part of the people who were just voted with their feet and got out. Like, I didn't meet any nurse who was like radical in India, and because they wouldn't have left in the same way, and they also were already, because they were able to leave, part of a higher class of nurses who had better education in India, right? So they were kind of already sort of moving up the ladder there. In terms of the U.S., because of this conflict over professionalization, they would tend to maybe shy away from some of the more overt forms of organizing, but then I would find a lot of community building that functioned as organizing in a way, so that Dr. Khanna would develop like these nursing societies or like these and then they would be a way for people to come together and commune, help new people who are coming into the country. So there's that kind of organizing I found, but not so much. I mean, would they connect to like domestic workers? And they don't see that, like many of them had worked as domestic workers when they first came to this country before they got accreditation. But this is a story of them trying to move out of it, so it's more conflicted. And because of race and because of all those other things, like they sort of, especially the nurses who I interviewed. Like, for example, if I had pursued more of the nurses who didn't make it into my story, that I might have heard different kinds of stories, right?
So what counts as nursing exactly? Because I'm wondering, about midwifery.
Midwifery is a huge thing.
So is that separate from
nursing? Well, in India, nursing and midwifery is very close because the whole thing was about childbirth, right? And
exactly.
only being able to get in there. So and then midwives were seen as Dalits, and so that brought the whole thing down even further. And like midwives were trained differently. That's a huge. Like mostly were Dalits, like outcasts, and so like that's very polluting. Like to be helping with childbirth is very polluting. So in India, they were really like, so there's a whole thing on midwives, right? But then coming here, it changes because exactly the time when Indian nurses entered the U.S. workforce was when hospitals in the U.S. desegregated. Post-60s. But prior to that, hospitals were segregated, right? And with the desegregation of hospitals came a new nursing division of labor, where now you have stratification from like, what is it? NP, nurse practitioner. RN, right? Nursing aide, like nursing whatever, and that gets stratified by race and class, right? Yeah, so that like nursing aides are all like from the Caribbean and like are women of color, and men will be nursing practitioners sometimes, right? Like, but race and class, like, and then like, so that really there was a reshuffling. Like RNs had just sort of become like more respectable in the U.S., but then as soon as hospitals desegregated, they changed the nursing division of labor to slot in people who weren't immigrants, people of color, and so like everyone wasn't able to enter at the same level. And now when you go into a hospital, like that's how it is. Yeah.
That's so interesting because I know that the bulk of your study is also sort of in the 20th century, but I'm thinking about the way in which within the British Empire, sort of broadly, that they also implemented things differently. So I'm thinking about the British in Egypt and the way that, so Khalid Fahmy talks about the school of midwives in 19th century Egypt and the way in which actually midwifery was a way to rehabilitate prostitutes.
Oh, really?
Yeah, to make them respectable.
Oh,
And
really?
so, yeah, and so
Well, they
it's,
tried
it's
to
so
make
interesting that this is almost the mirror image
But
of.
except for they tried to make it respectable in India too. But like,
Okay,
you
I'm
know,
wondering.
I don't want to let Indians entirely off. Like Indians
No,
are
no,
not
no, no.
into
I
that.
mean, I'm trying to think
Yeah.
about the inconsistencies of colonization and of empire,
Right.
also sort of within empire.
One of the things that happened in India was that when they tried to make midwiferys more like respectable, it
Yeah.
became a way for middle class Indian women to police more oppressed class
Yeah,
Indian
there
women
is the-
and to
yes,
like
yes,
lift themselves
absolutely.
up and say, okay, we need to like regulate your labor,
Yeah.
and that makes us kind of more.
Even more.
Yeah.
Exactly. Okay.
That's what they did. Same with nurse training. It was a way for Indian women to differentiate themselves from other Indian
Okay.
women. Yeah.
Interesting.
That's it.
Yeah. I have a bunch more questions, but I feel like I'm gonna hog the. So I was delivered by Indian nurses in the U.S.
No.
And my brother 3 years later was
Oh,
delivered
because Texas.
by Indian nurses in Kuwait.
Oh, really?
So I'm both
Yeah.
in the 70s, just
Yeah.
to make clear about how old we all are. And
70s were great.
so I find that, but like so one is in. It was actually in Detroit.
Detroit.
And so
Oh,
my brother
yes.
was born in Kuwait 3 years later. Both of us delivered by Indian nurses.
Oh,
Two
really?
very different contexts and countries and
Yes.
and
We're
continents.
everywhere.
Yeah, and
No,
I'm really curious about, and you touched on it just briefly just now about sort of the flows. Yeah, the flows of migration patterns of Indian nurses.
the Gulf is huge.
Yeah,
Huge,
but
huge, huge.
relative. So the ticket was the U.S. always seen as sort of the end of the rainbow kind of thing, or where was the Gulf in these?
The
patterns?
Gulf is
was
like,
it
I mean-
accidental stop, or was it a
Well,
destination?
I mean, especially because so many nurses come from Kerala. I mean, oh, by the way, the reason why most Indian nurses are Christian is because of the missionaries,
Okay.
because they're the ones that established. So that kind of does that. But the Gulf is great, but it's only for temporary migration. You can't settle in the Gulf.
Yeah.
And so the nurses that I
Can't
had
get
talked to,
citizenship,
you can't get citizenship.
yeah,
So the nurses I talked to who had moved from the Gulf to the United States moved because they wanted to educate their kids outside of India and they wanted to have families and stuff. So it was like the Gulf is good if you're going back and forth. Or but in terms of settling, like in terms of really immigrating, you have to come to the U.S. That was the difference.
Okay.
Because you make more money in the Gulf. You don't have to do as much. I mean, life was better there in most ways for them, but except for the fact that they couldn't long term.
They would always be second-class citizens or
Yeah.
third-class.
Yeah, they could never
In
plan
spite
long
of
term.
the medical profession.
Yeah. And that did come later. It's more like in '80s. Like the Gulf became more of a thing in the '80s. Although I guess your brother was delivered.
Yeah,
in the
no,
70s.
I mean
They were going there
maybe
too, but it
sort
got
of
bigger
swelled
in the
80s.
Yeah,
but
it
there
became
was
bigger in the
definitely a critical mass
Yeah.
in the 70s.
Well, in the Gulf, it
I
wasn't just from
remember that.
India. It was also like from
Right.
Iran, from other countries.
Yeah,
Philippines,
but yeah,
a lot of Indians.
okay, yeah, and nursing especially as far
Yeah.
as my like little child memory. So great.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Thank you guys for coming.
Thank
I
you
really
so much.
appreciate it.
That was
I
amazing.
really appreciate it.
Appreciate it. Thank you again. Thanks.